Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for our tax season 2021 question and answer session. My name is Connor Blay, and today we are going to be answering the questions you have about filing tax returns as an international student in the US. At internationalstudent.com, we have a comprehensive tax section that can provide you with a good start this tax season. There you will find tax filing steps, answers to frequently asked questions, and our tax form 8843 wizard. However, we know that filing a tax return is not a simple process, so we wanted to provide you with the chance to get your questions answered directly. So get your tax questions ready and please send them in the comments. To answer your questions today, we have a tax expert joining us. Without further ado, let me introduce our special guest, Neil Duffy from Sprint Tax. Hi, Neil. How are you?
Hi, Connor. How are you today?
Good, good. Thank you so much for joining us and helping me answer some questions about tax returns.
Absolutely. We're happy to be here.
Yeah, happy to have you again. I want to remind everyone that if you need personalized help this tax season, please visit our tax section on internationalstudent.com, and the link will be in the comments. There you can find more information about Sprint Tax and how they can help you. Be sure to stay tuned until the end of the event, as Neil will be sharing the $5 off discount code for Sprint Tax services. But now, before we get to our viewer questions, I want to start off with some questions that we get frequently from students. The first question I have is, how do you know if you have to file a tax return?
Yeah, sure. So it's a good question. So there's probably a couple of rules around that everybody should be aware of. And first, I suppose, before we go into it, it's an important point to note that during this filing period, we're really just focused on the 2020 tax year. So everything we're talking about during this webinar is really focused on the income that you've earned during 2020. So for the point of your tax return, you can kind of forget about everything else when you're going through the online process. But in terms of kind of knowing whether you have a filing requirement, well, first off, everybody needs to do something. And that minimum is Form 8843. And Form 8843 is a document that applies to every non-resident here in the US, regardless of how much income they've earned, regardless of the number of days they've actually spent in the US. If you are on your JRF visa for even just one day, that's enough to trigger that filing requirement. After that, then we start to look at those non-residents that have actually earned income. So if you've earned over $0 in US income during 2020, you'll then trigger an additional federal filing requirement. So at this stage, you now have Form 8843, you now have your federal requirement, and then you may also have a state filing requirement. Now, the state filing requirements, they change from state to state, and there are some lucky non-residents living in states that don't have income tax whatsoever. But once you go onto the Sprint Tax website, once you enter in your income information, once you provide us with information on the states that you've lived in, we'll tell you if you've triggered Form 8843, a federal, or if it's a state, we'll tell you if it's 0, 1, or multiple states. I think last year we had one user who had to do 7 different state filing returns. But that's the job of the software. We'll definitely tell you that and assist you with that.
All right, excellent. Thanks for that answer. So the next question I have is, how do you know, or how do I know if I'm a resident or non-resident for tax purposes?
Yeah, look, this is definitely the number one question that we get every single year. And it's definitely confusing because you can be a non-resident for immigration purposes, which I imagine most people tuning into this webcast are, but you can be a non-resident for immigration purposes and a resident for tax purposes at the exact same time. So the first point there is that the two are not linked in any way whatsoever. And when it comes to tax, it's all based on the number of days you've actually spent in the US. So there's a couple of rules around that. And generally those rules are associated with the visa type that you're on. So for the sake of this webcast, I'm going to use 2 visa types. I'm going to first talk about J1 and F1 student visas. So if you're on a J1 or an F1 student visa, generally you're considered a non-resident by the IRS for your first 5 calendar years here in the US. So after you go past that 5-year period then, so year 6, the IRS will then look at what's known as the substantial presence test. And the substantial presence test is essentially a maths equation that looks at the last 3 years you've been in the US and sees if your total days of presence equate to 183 days. Now, I'm simplifying the substantial presence test quite a bit, but for anyone that's writing tons of notes, trying to figure out where they stand within that process, I would say don't panic too much. That's what the SprintTax software is there to help with. And there's a free part of that software, which is step 1. So if you register an account with SprintTax, if you go onto the website, you'll see that on step 1, we ask you for some basic yes or no questions. So are you a US citizen? Have you applied for a green card? And then we'll get on to your entry and exit dates. And on the software, we'll ask you for all of your entry and exit dates since you first started entering the US. So once you give us that information, we'll then tell you if you're a resident or a non-resident for tax purposes right away. And if we find that you are a resident, we'll stop the process and advise you that you can use a website like TurboTax. But if you're a non-resident, we'll allow you to move on to step 2. So that's the J1 and the F1 student visa. If you have anyone then on a J1 researcher, scholar, trainee, intern, any of those kind of J working visas, generally there's a different rule. So instead of that 5-year period that we just spoke about, generally those visa types are given 2 years, 2 calendar years, where they're generally automatically considered a non-resident for tax purposes. And then after they go past that 2 out of the last 6-year period, so let's say they're on year 3, the IRS again will look at the substantial presence test. And if their total days of presence equate to 183 days within that period, again, they'll be a resident. But again, let the SprintTax software do the work for you. Fill out your information on step 1, and then we'll give you the result.
All right, fantastic, great answer. So next, there is a lot of talk about stimulus checks right now. So do international students get the check? And if you filed incorrectly, how do you correct that?
Yeah, definitely training at the moment, particularly this week. I suppose when we look at the stimulus check, it's not really based on international students. It's more so based on whether they're a resident or a non-resident for tax purposes. So the rule that we kind of just went through. And when we look at non-residents, anyone that is a non-resident, they're actually not eligible to receive the stimulus payment. You're only eligible to receive that payment if you're considered a resident and you make under a certain threshold. Now, I'm not going to go into the income thresholds because it is a non-resident tax webinar and it might confuse some people. But just for everyone to be aware, as a non-resident, you are not eligible for the payment and you shouldn't have received the payment. But unfortunately, we have seen that quite a few non-residents have received this payment in error. And every time we sit down with the non-resident, we look at their documents for the last number of years, the same issue always emerges. And that's that they filed as a resident in error, somewhere maybe in 2019 or 2018. So if that does happen and you're thinking, okay, I'm a non-resident, I received this payment in error, what do I do next? The first step that you need to do is figure out which year you filed incorrectly for. So if it was 2019, you'll then need to do an amended return for 2019. An amended return will be Form 1040X and also Form 1040NR, which is the correct non-resident US tax return form for federal returns. So once you send both of those documents to the IRS, you're essentially telling them, this is the error I've made, this is what I'm doing to correct that mistake. On top of that, then, you need to give back the stimulus check. And there's 2 ways of doing it, depending on whether that check was issued via check or direct deposit. I would say have a look on the SprintTax blog. So if you Google SprintTax stimulus check, we break down the exact steps to take in order to send that check back. But either way, we can assist you with the amended return. And then with regards to the steps to physically send it back, we'll assist you via our blog.
Great. Awesome. Thanks for that answer.
Sure.
So last year, because of the pandemic, a lot of students had to go back to their home countries. How do taxes affect students in this situation?
Yeah, sure. Definitely a big trending issue with COVID. And I guess we kind of need to look at that in two different ways. The first is if you had a student here up until March, they were earning income up until March, and then they went back to their home country and kind of everything stopped. In that case, they'll still have a filing requirement for Form 8843 for the period they were here from January to March. If they earned income from January to March, they'll also still have a federal filing requirement. And then obviously, depending on the state they live in, they may also have a state filing requirement. So just because they're overseas doesn't mean that they still don't need to send their documents into the IRS. The IRS still requests that you follow the same guidelines. The deadline is April the 15th, so you do need to have those documents sent in for that date. And then if you do that, you'll be fully tax compliant. I guess there's probably another issue then that we're seeing because of COVID, because of a lot of people moving back to their home country. And that's again, if we look at the same situation, you have, let's say, a J1 intern working here in the US from January to March, then went back to their home country, but were being paid by that company still. They were working online, maybe back in Ireland or France. That's probably a bit more complicated in that situation, because the student is a non-resident, if they were working for that US-based company overseas, the income that they earned while overseas is not eligible for an IRS. You do not need to claim that on your non-resident tax return. But there is a very good chance that that will need to be claimed on a tax return in your home country. And you may trigger filing requirements in your home country for that income you've earned. So you can see why it gets slightly complicated depending on where that student is working from overseas. The good news is Sprintax will be able to assist you with that. You know, if you have received an income document and only part of that income was earned within the US, we'll now ask you certain questions to identify which part is taxable within the US versus outside.
Great. You did a great job of clearing that up, and it is a little bit confusing, but yeah, that makes it a lot more clear. So for any of these students in these situations, we talked about a taxpayer number. How would they get a taxpayer number?
Yeah, again, tricky one this year. So a taxpayer identification number it's just to give background of what it is. It's a number for anyone that may have triggered a filing requirement but is not eligible to work in the US. So for anyone that is not eligible for a social security number but have a federal or state filing requirement, they'll need to apply for an ITIN. And this year, getting an ITIN overseas, it's quite difficult. But there are some ways to get that ITIN. If you have a federal or state filing requirement and you do need an ITIN, you will prepare Form W7 with your federal tax return. So you'll send both documents in together. But with the ITIN, you do need to actually get your documents certified. So essentially, you need to go to an agency which looks at your passport and looks at the information on your W7 or your ITIN application, and essentially verifies that that the information is correct on both. And obviously, being overseas, normally you'd go to an IRS office in the state that you're living or working in, and it's a fairly straightforward process. This year, the options that the IRS are giving are: one, either see if there is an international IRS office near you. They do have some; they are limited, as you'd probably expect, but there is some resources online to find if there are offices in the country that you're currently living in. The other option that the IRS will accept is that the agency that actually issued the passport, that'll actually qualify to certify those documents. So maybe you need to book an appointment with that agency and again bring in your W7 and get those documents certified. But this year it's complicated, it's messy, and it's not the most straightforward thing for anyone that is overseas.
Yeah, unfortunately, that is true, but that definitely clears it up. Thanks for that answer.
Sure.
I have one last question, and then we'll get to our viewer questions.
Sure.
Can you file tax returns online as an international student?
For the most part, for any international students, they will always need to mail their documents directly into the IRS. So that applies to their Form 8843 will always need to be mailed. Via Sprintax, for the most part, you will need to physically mail your federal return into the IRS. Now, there may be an option in 2 weeks where a small number of non-residents can actually e-file their federal return with Sprintax. But at checkout, if you are eligible for that, we'll tell you. So we'll give you very clear instructions whether you need to mail your document in or whether it's e-file. So I would say follow those instructions once we do provide them to you. And then again, with state documents on Sprintax, again, you will need to physically mail them. So in a lot of cases, the instructions that you'll get once you fill out the online questionnaire will be 1, print out this document, 2, sign it on this specific page, attach your income documents that you've received, so your W-2 or your 1099 or your 1042S, and then physically mail this document to the IRS at this specific address. And then by doing that, you'll be fully caught up on taxes for the year and fully tax compliant.
All right, great. Thanks, Neil.
Sure.
So now I'm going to turn to our viewer questions and see what we have from you guys. Keep on sending them in. We have a bunch already. And the first one came from Fareed. Hello, I am an F1 student and it's my very first time to file taxes. I'm confused as to where to start. So where would Fareed start with his taxes, or their taxes?
So I guess a good place to start would be to figure out if you have earned any income within the US. So if you've earned any income within the US, generally you'll receive an income document. So like I just mentioned, either W-2, 1042S, or 1099. They're your 3 income documents. So once you have your income documents, you can then go to the Sprintax website. You can register an account and then simply answer the questions as they appear. So the whole point of the software is we'll ask you questions in a very basic way, but at the end, we'll have enough information to generate your tax return for you. So that's probably the step that I would follow. And then once you've done all that, again, we'll give you the next set of instructions at the end, which will be, like I mentioned, print off, sign, and mail it to the IRS.
Right. All right, thanks. So the next question comes from Diana. What forms should an OPT student making income fill out?
So again, that depends. You know, if this particular OPT student has earned income, then certainly Form 8843 if they're in the US. If they've earned any US income, it'll be federal, and then depending on the state they're in, they may also trigger state filing requirements. So it'll be the same rules if you're on OPT versus not on OPT. The same rules will apply to you that applies to everybody else as a non-resident.
Okay, great. So the next question comes from Sayed. I have a special case for this tax filing. I was a student at ASU for spring 22, and then after a semester, I took a transfer to Texas University. But during my stay at ASU, I worked on campus for 4 months. But because of COVID-19, all Social Security number offices were closed, and I could not get my Social Security number. Recently, I've received my Social Security number from Texas and want to file taxes, but my W-2 from ASU does not have Social Security number. What should I do?
So pretty common situation this year. I would reach out to ASU and request that they add that Social Security number onto your W-2. And by doing that, that'll save a lot of hassle when you do send in those tax returns to the IRS. They'll be able to verify this W-2 is in fact associated with you, and it'll just make things a little easier. So I would say start communicating with that office that sent out the W-2 right away.
All right. So we have another question from Diana. Should the tax forms be filled out on the computer or by hand? We kind of already answered this, but
yeah. So look, I'm obviously a representative from Sprintax, so I'm going to say Sprintax. But if you're using that software, we'll do it for you online. There's also the option to get the forms from the IRS website and do them yourself. So there's two options. If you want to do them yourself, and then certainly you can print them off, and then you can fill them out by hand.
Okay. So next one comes from Howie. Can an international student file a tax return from their tuition without a social security number?
So first off, in terms of your tuition, as a non-resident, there aren't any tax deductions for your tuition that you paid. And in a lot of cases, we have students receive Form 1098T, which is kind of the educational tax credit form, but it is only applicable to residents. So if you are a non-resident and you have received this form, you've likely received it in error. So you can put it away for your own records, but Sprintax isn't going to ask you about it as you go through the online process. It's just not relevant as a non-resident. To answer the second part of that, so can you file a tax return without a social security number? You can. So for instance, if you have earned income within the US and you've triggered a federal or state, you'll need either an ITIN or a social security number. So if you're not eligible to work, so you're not eligible for a social security number, you'll then need to apply for an ITIN, which is the process that we just mentioned a few minutes ago.
Right. Okay, great. So next question is from Sebastian. Hi, I'm enrolled since last August in a university in Detroit, but because of the pandemic, I haven't been able to be in the USA, and I've just been studying online at the moment in Mexico. I have 2 scholarships, one from the college I'm in and one from a company that paid the other part of my tuition. Do I need to file a tax or fill out a tax form despite not having been in the US?
So that kind of goes back to the scenario we mentioned a while ago, where for this particular non-resident, they're overseas. They've never been in the US. So for that reason, because they were never here during 2020, they don't need to fill out Form 8843. They haven't met that requirement. They've also been receiving a taxable scholarship and income from a US company or school, but again, they haven't been in the US. So for that reason, they won't trigger a US filing requirement. That will be considered foreign source income. I would just say for that particular non-resident, be careful because you're earning that income technically in your home country now, which means that you'll need to have a look, what are the tax rules around your home country? There's a very good chance you'll need to file something back there, but certainly within the US, it doesn't trigger an IRS filing requirement because you've never been to the US during 2020 and you're a non-resident.
Gotcha. All right, that makes sense. So the next question comes from Samara. I've never done taxes. I'm in my 4th year in school, never received a scholarship. Is that okay? I did file in December when I got my first stipend and will file this year.
So it sounds like, so if you've been here for 4 years, I'm going to presume you're a non-resident. You've mentioned that you haven't earned income for the years that you haven't filed, which sounds like you needed to have done Form 8843, which is that requirement that applies to everyone, regardless of how much income you've earned. So I would say catch up. This year, when you're doing your tax returns, you'll see that we'll prepare Form 8843 for you. Why not go online, print off the Form 8843 document, and then fill it in similar to how Sprintax did it for you. It's a very straightforward form. The questions that we ask, the questions that the IRS ask on the Form 8843 are pretty basic. So if you have Sprintax assist you with this year, you'll see that it'll be pretty easy to also complete Form 8843 for previous years on your own.
All right. And then Samara has another question. If you have a social security number, do you need a taxpayer number?
No, if you have a social security number, you will never need an ITIN. The social security number always trumps the ITIN.
All right, thanks. So the next questions are from Paulden. How do I file my taxes with 1099 NEC? Can I use a service and do it online?
Yeah, so with the 1099 NEC, it's a case of choosing it from the drop-down menu and then adding that to your tax return. So you'll see there's a full list of options which says all the different variations of the 1099 document. Once you choose 1099 NEC, you can fill in the blank template that we provide to you, and then we'll add that to your tax return.
All right. And then they have another question. Can F1 students claim American Opportunity Tax Credit? I haven't claimed anything for the past 4 years.
No, so there's very few tax credits that you can claim as a non-resident. Really, when you're doing your tax return as a non-resident, you're essentially balancing the books with the IRS. So that means as you earned income throughout 2020, you're essentially looking to see if too much tax was withheld or too little tax. And then you're ensuring that you're correcting that either by getting a refund or else providing the IRS with the money that's owed. But certainly with any deductions like that, it wouldn't be applicable for a non-resident.
Right. Okay. So the next question is from Pammy. Hi, I'm in my 5th year in the US. My OPT will expire in May 2021. I have a social security number and have filed 2019 tax return on TurboTax. May I learn if I'm eligible for the resident tax because I only have a W-2, and if I filed it incorrectly as a resident last year, how much would I pay to work on my tax return this year with Sprint Tax? Thank you.
So I suppose that's a funny one, because first of all, you need to figure out if you're a resident or a non-resident. So sounds like you used TurboTax last year. I would say go into Sprint Tax and choose the 2019 tax year and fill out step 1, which is the entry and exit date step. If we allow you to go on to step 2, it means you're a non-resident, which means that you incorrectly used TurboTax. If we stop the process and say you're a resident, it means that's okay, you used TurboTax in a correct manner. If for some reason you used it in error, it means that you sent an incorrect tax document to the IRS. So you'll need to amend your return online. You can go on, log in, choose the tax year you want to amend, and then answer the questions as they appear on the screen. And then we'll prepare Form 1040X and Form 1040NR for you. The cost is $70 on Sprint Tax.
All right. And I just want to remind our viewers that we've put a link in the comments to learn more about tax returns and how Sprint Tax can help. That might help out with any questions about pricing or anything like that. So the next question I have is from Min. I wonder, how can I file Schedule K1 Form 1065 as an international student? Does Sprint Tax support that form?
I don't believe we do, no. So with a form like that, I'm not too sure if it is eligible for your non-resident tax return. I can look into it afterwards and come back to that comment. But certainly just thinking about the Sprint Tax software, I don't believe we do ask about that, which would mean that it isn't eligible. But I do want to have a look to see what that form is actually related to, and I can answer then in the comment section.
Okay, sounds good. So this next question, I'm sorry if I say this wrong, but Yudkarsh has this question. I am an international student, non-resident, and I have used Robinhood for stocks. And I was wondering if Sprint Tax allows us to add this during earning during tax filing.
Yep, we absolutely do. So with kind of online trading accounts like Robinhood, the rule is that if you have sold your stock or holdings during 2020, you should expect to receive an income document from the likes of Robinhood or E-Trade or whoever your brokerage account is with. So once you get that 1099, you can then choose it from the drop-down menu in Sprint Tax, and then you can enter in all of your holdings that you've sold and the information that's associated with each one. And then we'll include that on your non-resident tax return.
Excellent. So next question is from Vanessa. Do international students who receive a scholarship need a social security in order to file their taxes?
It depends. If your scholarship is taxable, then you will need a tax identification number. And just to confirm what a taxable scholarship is, it's any scholarship that covers areas outside of tuition. So if you have a scholarship that covers areas like room and board, maybe your Metro card, anything that's outside of tuition, you will then need to file. You'll definitely trigger a federal and maybe a state, depending on where you live. When you have triggered a federal, you mentioned social security number. Yes, if you can get a social security number, you will need that. But if you're not eligible for a social security number, that's then when the ITIN becomes applicable, and you'll need to apply for the ITIN in conjunction with your federal return. So it's either or, but the social security number always trumps the ITIN. So if you have that, you'll never need the ITIN.
Excellent. So we're running out of time, unfortunately, so we have time for one last question. But don't worry, if we didn't get to your question, we will answer them later in the comments. This question comes from Momo. It's my 5th year in the US, but I have been on F1 visa. Should I still acquire ITIN?
So again, that depends. If you've triggered a filing requirement, then you might need one. If you're not eligible for a social security number and you've triggered that filing requirement, then you might need one. There's a whole host of different factors that we'd have to ask a few more questions to really understand if this non-resident does need an ITIN. But I would say if you have earned US income as a non-resident, then you'll need either the social security or the ITIN. If you're eligible for the social security, then you won't need the ITIN. If you're not eligible to work, but you've earned income in some way, so let's say Robinhood stocks, that taxable scholarship, then you'll need the ITIN instead of the social security. But the good news is, once you're going through the sprint tax process, we'll identify if you need a social security or an ITIN. And then if you need that ITIN, we'll prepare that for you, which is Form W7 in conjunction with your federal tax return. So a lot of the questions that you'll have, the software will answer that as it goes through the online process.
All right, fantastic. So thank you guys for being so active and asking so many questions. Again, we're gonna go ahead and answer those later. I'll get Neil's response if you didn't get your question answered during the stream. So we'll wrap this up today. Just a reminder that we have the link to our student tax return section in the comments, and then you can learn more about Sprint Tax and their services there. You will also be able to access our other tax return resources, including our Tax Form 8843 Wizard, which helps you populate the form with a little bit of tax information from your end. So that's pretty much it. Is there anything else that you'd like to add? Perhaps a discount code, Neil?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the discount code is going into the comments now. So once you get to the checkout screen, feel free to put in that discount code, and then that will give $5 off your federal return. It is first come, first serve, so there is 150 uses on it. So I would say get in there, get the process started as soon as possible, and avail of that discount. Right. But other than that, thank you everybody for joining.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Neil, for being here with me today. Wouldn't have been able to do it without you. So,
sure.
Yeah, looking forward to next time. We'll see you guys then. Bye.
Sounds good. Thanks, Connor. Thanks, everyone.